Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hello and welcome to episode 31 of the podcast. I'm Nick, I'm your host, and in today's interview I talk with Dan Scott, and Dan and I talk about story, the power of story, how it's used in the Bible, and how we can, harness that and make sure we use it as we're teaching kids and teaching students. Because so much of how we learn, all of us, but especially kids and students learn, is through story. That's some of the best way they can learn. And so how do we use that as we're trying to teach them the Bible? And so we talk about what it looks like in the Bible, and then we also get practical and talk about what does it look like as you train and lead your teachers and storytellers to lead kids and students. So you're going to love this, I think. I think it's really important. A lot of the principles we talk about are really helpful. Before we jump in, just want to remind you this is the last week that you can take the ratio survey. So the survey of your volunteers and your staff, basically where you provide the input to say this is how many kids or how many students we have at our church, this is how many volunteers, and this is how many full-time equivalent staff we have. I'd love your input on that survey because when it's all said and done, we'll have, lots and lots of churches give their input, and you'll be able to look and compare and say, okay, where does our church line up in terms of the staffing and the volunteer level, with the input in the survey. So the more people that fill it out, the better. There are prizes on the line because I'm not above bribing, and I just want to say thanks. So be sure to fill that out. It closes on Friday. So if you're listening to this when it comes out, it closes in just a few days, and I'd love to have your church's input in there. Everything that I talk about with Dan can be found in the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 31. But let's go ahead and listen in as I talk with Dan Scott about story. Today I'm joined by Dan Scott. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Nick. How's it going?
I'm doing well. How about you?
We're doing great.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and your family and what you do at Orange.
Yeah, absolutely. So my wife and I, we have 4 kids. We live north of Atlanta, Georgia. Absolutely love it here. Moved down about 5 years ago to work with the Orange team. I specifically work with 252 Basics. I'm the curriculum director, which basically means that everything that's related to large group and small group for kids, I help oversee and the creative process, for what happens and what we talk about and when we talk about it, that sort of thing.
Remind me, I've seen you all talk about how many millions of words that you write,
yeah.
Because you write a lot of words for curriculum and large group and script and parent pieces. And what's that number?
252, just our elementary curriculum, puts out around 600,000 words a month. Ooh. And so that's, all of our video products, all the scripts for those, then all the small group material, the large group scripts. It adds up. It's amazing. Thankfully, it's not just one person that has to, make all that happen. Yeah, we have a great team of writers that we contract with that, just knock it out of the park month after month.
That's awesome. And we want to talk about communicating and specifically telling the Bible story, teaching. Some people don't think of it as like telling the story. They only think of it maybe as teaching. But we do that in kids ministry and student ministry. And so you're passionate about story, like telling the story well. Why is story important, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a quote by an author. His name is Stephen James. And he wrote, "Humans are rarely interested in truth unless it's wrapped up in a story." So much information is just thrown at us all the time, right? We live in the information age. There's all sorts of things happening and all sorts of, information being thrown at us all the time. And, if we look at how kids learn, they have a hard time connecting just random bits of truth to their life. And the best way to do that, is through some sort of narrative. Story and imagination are uniquely human. We are the only creature that can, put ourselves in a completely different narrative and assume that it's our own. And what I mean by that is there was research done where they, hooked up people to all these wires and they had them watch a horror film. And what the brain was doing and what the heart was doing, it was actually as if they were experiencing the terror, the grief, the sadness themselves. And that emotional connection creates a hook for that truth to hang. So not only do we understand it, but it makes it sticky, and we remember it.
And like you experience it as if you were there, and you're saying, and your point too is that animals can't do that. They can't sit around and tell a story, one. But just the idea of like imagining yourself in the other story is something that's unique to us. And if we can do that, that would help. It helps what we're trying to teach get across better, as opposed to here's just some important facts.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and this is the way kids, they learn. Like, this is intuitive to them. Like, if you ever watch preschoolers play, they imagine this entire scenario. Like, they could just, have a play kitchen, and all of a sudden there's a mom and there's a dad, or there's, a sister and a brother, and they're cooking and they're making food. And, they had this whole scenario where they're playing out this problem solution scenario that wasn't given to them. It was just, they intuitively, pick that up. And it's not until we're told that that's childish that we stop doing that. So, like sometimes people say, storytellers are just adults who haven't lost the ability to imagine. And I love that idea. This is, okay, so I don't know when this is going to air, but, this past week in our culture, the Cubs just won the World Series. Yeah. All right. And so it was amazing to watch this all play out, because normally a World Series, unless it's your team, unless you have a dog in the fight, you're not watching this. It's baseball. Some people love it. Some people don't. I think the entire nation, except if you were in Cleveland, was rooting for the Cubs. And they were rooting for them because of their narrative, because, this 108-year history, the curses and the theories and all of that. And it just absolutely, it makes people enamored with the moment. And I think that's what story has the power to do. So we have truths in Scripture, and story opens your mind to the wonder of what's actually being, told in that moment. And so you're immediately bought in.
What are the problems? So, knowing that that's how, we learn best, that's how kids and students learn best. What are the problems that you see as it relates to how children's and student ministries might be teaching the Bible now if they're not leveraging story?
Yeah. When you look at, we read blogs all the time. We are seeing what people are talking about when it comes to the Bible and communicating the Bible to the next generation. And there seems to be this fear that kids aren't going to know the facts about the Bible. Some people call it this idea of biblical literacy. When I throw out a phrase like that, people are like, oh, it means that, you need to know the 12 disciples, and you need to know, the journeys of Paul and all the different cities that he went to. And that's what they teach. When I was in seminary, I had people that I was alongside, we were classmates, and they were like, oh, I can't wait to, teach my students historical theology too. And you're like, what? What? I don't even know what to do with that, because they're not going to know what to do with that. It's absolutely not urgent to them. They don't care about that. And it's not, this is where it gets tricky, right? Because you can't argue and say, well, biblical literacy is bad. And I don't think it is. I think that we need to have a proper view of what that means. And so I was trained as an educator. I taught elementary school for a year before I retired and went into church work.
A year and then retirement. That's pretty good.
A year and then I was retired. I was like, I'm done. This is awful. But it actually spurred me on to do what I do now, because I saw that, kids, what I taught Bible, and the curriculum that they gave me was just a bunch of questions about the book of Mark. And I looked and I was like, wow, they're going to know all of these details, but they're going to miss the message. And I never want kids to know all of these things about the Bible, but never give them a chance or a way to engage the Bible and make it their own. And I think that's what story can do, because it changes the way we communicate. And if I look at like literacy in general, like I learned how to read, I learned how to write, but it wasn't just for reading and writing. It was so I could apply that in situations other than that situation when I was in third grade and I was, learning how to read novels, or when I was in preschool and I was learning the letter sounds and patterns. Like all of that served a purpose. And if we're just teaching facts about the Bible and they have all of this head knowledge, it doesn't ultimately serve a purpose. Like I want kids to be able to approach the Bible and realize that the Bible is not just some history book or instruction manual, but that it's living and breathing, and it's God's way of communicating his story to us, a story that, honestly, isn't over yet. And so what story allows us to do is allows us to engage kids and say, hey, God's not done telling this story. And guess what? You're a part of it. And, it makes God's story their story. And that's where I want to see communicators go, and inviting kids, inviting students into this story that they play a role in.
Yeah, because you would say, right, that if the goal was just to transfer information, story might not be as important. Where story is important is when you want them to apply it, their life to be changed, that kind of thing. That's why, it's okay to lecture in college, because really they're just trying to feed you information that you're going to try to memorize, and
absolutely
long enough to do the test and then forget it.
And like when I grew up in a Christian school, and so I took Bible tests all the time about the factual information. But those tests can only tell you what you know about the Bible. It's not going to tell you how you're going to use that information. It's not going to tell you what you feel about that information. I tell this story on Orange Tour that's like, hey, you could have an A+ in advanced applied chemistry, and with that, you could either create the next world-changing medicine, or you could know how to cook the best meth possible, and it's so what I want us to be able to say is like, hey kids, it's important to know the Bible, but just knowing the Bible doesn't make you an A+ Christian, because I have I carry around a smartphone. I think a lot of people carry around smartphones. I can access facts about the Bible in a second. That is not the most important thing for me to communicate, because if I can teach kids, hey, if you know how to navigate your Bible app, you can find out all of this information. What's going to be harder for you is how to make those connections of why that matters right now. And that's what story does, because story, I'm looking at these kids and I'm looking at their story, and then I'm looking at God's story, and I'm able to, connect it. And, that's where I really want our large group environments, our communication environments to go, is that we're always pointing them to the greater story that God is telling.
Before we jump into what it can look like as we try to do this better, teaching kids and students, how would you say story is present in the Bible? Because you talk about it in a way that maybe we could miss, that actually story is used as a teaching technique in the Bible, in Scripture already. It's built in there, and God's leveraging it. So how does God use story maybe in some ways through the Bible that we don't even see?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think that has been, for me, I've been researching story over the past, I guess it's been about a year. And one of the things that's amazing to find is that these narratives that have been passed down, for thousands of years at this point, they follow these universal story patterns that are present in the oldest written stories that we have. And when you start to dig in and you read you read the Bible for the genre, not just, hey, this is the Bible, but like, hey, this is poetry. Hey, these are proverbs. Hey, these are stories and narratives and parables. They all start to follow a narrative pattern that we see everywhere, and especially in folk tales, which is, I don't know, like some people are like, why does fiction matter? I think fiction matters a ton. I'm not saying that the Bible's fiction, but I think that there's something to these universal story patterns that, I don't know, might even be tied to what it means to be created in God's image, that this is how God has revealed himself to us and is how he created us to engage with him. And so there's these rules in folktales. It's called the rule of 3 and the rule of 4. And for the rule of 3, the number 3 is like this number of struggle, growth, and transformation. So for a second, think about the story of Jonah, right? So Jonah, he's this reluctant missionary that does not want to do this. And he actually runs away from God. He's in the whale for 3 days. Okay, over those 3 days, he has struggle, growth, and transformation. By the time that he gets, thrown up out onto the shore, he's ready to do what God has asked him to do. And he goes and he does it. And this happens in the story of Joseph. Joseph is his father's favorite. He's sold. Then he becomes Potiphar's favorite. He's thrown into jail. Then he becomes the cupbearer's, quote unquote favorite, in is that the cupbearer realizes that Joseph has value, and he's going to go to Pharaoh and he's going to say, hey, you have to save this guy, Joseph. He's in prison and whatever. And then he's forgotten. And there's this transformation that happens, that when Joseph is finally ready to stand before Pharaoh, when he finally gets remembered and he finally gets out, he realizes that he can trust God no matter what, and that God is going to help him do what he needs to do in that moment in front of Pharaoh. What's amazing is that there's another rule, the rule of 4, and that is like this rule, the number 4 being representative of like perfect resolution, completion. And in that Joseph story, you have this moment where he ends up becoming second in command in all of Egypt. And so there was this journey that he went on that ended up resulting in this ultimate moment for him, which is amazing. Like when you think about it. And in fact, it's like the Bible over time, which is only what we would say is like God's providence, right? That all of these stories over time have kind of ended up creating this giant narrative that follows the rule of 4. So you have creation, you have fall, you have redemption. You have all of these moments where God is continually calling out a people for his name, and they keep failing. They try, they fail, they try, they fail until Jesus comes. And we live in this time where there's redemption with the cross and the price that Jesus paid and his resurrection, but we're still not perfect. It's still not complete. And that's that fourth and final movement of the Bible narrative, where there's the new heaven and the new earth. And what's crazy is that, the best rule of 4 happens in the happily ever after, that Cinderella moment where the prince gets the princess and they get married and there's a feast. And isn't it amazing that scripture talks about, the end where the bride of Christ has a wedding feast with the groom, with Christ. And we end up living in this new heaven, this new earth, in this happily ever after moment. And that's how we read story. And that's how God wrote his Bible to us. And so it's like this immediate hook for readers. And I don't think we engage kids and students especially probably with this, because we just start throwing verses at them. Remember this, remember this, remember this. And we miss the fact that there's this giant story that they already have a frame of reference for, because they've read, they've watched Cinderella. They get that there's a happily ever after. And we can engage them on that level with story in the Bible, which is, when I look at it, my mind is blown. But you need to end up starting to get practical with it, right? And that's where, I think the second half of our conversation is going to lead, because it's great to have all of this theory, but how do we take all of that theory and put it into practice, in our large group environments?
Yeah, and even there, like something I think about as you talk about the 3s and the 4s and the story of the Bible, it's probably just a reminder to especially if we're writing and teaching from scratch. I guess it's different if we're using a curriculum or something like that. But even then, we could evaluate it this way. We should probably be careful not to remove the verses and use them on their own without the powerful story they're already a part of.
Absolutely.
We could do some stuff with it and try to, create the same thing. But why would we do that if we could just tell Joseph's story more completely so that they can find themselves in his story, as opposed to pulling out, and the Lord was with Joseph, only that verse, and then just writing your own teaching on it. I mean, that's important, and it is true, so that's a good point. I think that's a practical thing right there, where we can maybe try to view it like, well, how can I tell this the way it was written, the way the original people, hearers heard it, and pull them in. And I know for leaders, children's leaders, student leaders, the biggest challenge they have, they're thinking about this, but you and I know the biggest challenge they have is, how do I practically help my team, especially volunteers, teach the Bible better, engage their audience better? Even me, all staff too. Like, how do we teach in a way that engages our audience better? And you say it starts with the audience. Like, you got to really think about who they are. So why is that important? How do you begin? Yeah,
absolutely. Where I look at it is I really feel like one of the biggest, I think there are 3 narratives at play when we're communicating to an audience. And so the first one, is your theological narrative. Like, what are you telling from the Bible? Which is super important. Obviously, we need to, start there. But we also need to look at another narrative at play, and that's the personal narrative. Like, what is happening in the lives of kids matters. Because if we're going to connect that theological narrative to them in a way that it's not just information that they know, but it's something that transforms their heart, it really helps if we know their stories. And that's going to be hard, right? Like, I speak at this camp every year. It's called Woodlands Camp. It's in the mountains of Georgia. And so when I go up there, there's going to be 400, there's 400 kids. I don't know them. There's no way I can know all 400 kids, but there are some things that I can find out about them when I talk to the camp director. Most of them come from, the Atlanta suburbs. Well, I know that. I live there. That's easy. Like, they are, middle class or upper middle class. They don't really have any needs. They don't have many, they have more wants. They don't have like a felt need. It's different, because they already have things. So I could write all my talks based on those, but I'd be missing part of that audience, because what I found out the first time I spoke there was that the camp tithes 10% of their attenders, of their campers, to the Department of Family Services. And so they get kids from inner city Atlanta that are in foster care, or they come from severely broken homes. Some of them, their parents are in jail. Okay, so that narrative is very different from the main narrative of the kids in the room. But knowing that, I can then tailor the story of the Bible. Not that I'm changing it, but the focus that I give it now can include those kids with a different narrative than the other kids in the room. So how I'm going to help them apply it is obviously going to be different. When I did a series on taking risks, their risks are going to be very different from the risks of the middle class kid. And, knowing that helps me tell a better story, so it really comes down to contextualizing the message.
Yeah, otherwise they would be left out. I know our pastor says, he'll say so. He's talking about teaching, in the main services, but he'll talk about how we have a tendency to teach to ourselves. So like we look at people and think they're all us, But
For
obviously, in almost any church, that's not true. So you alienate people just like you would have alienated those kids. Whereas if you think about it, if you're aware of it, you can find ways to not use that illustration that only fits them.
Yes.
Right? Maybe use this one that fits everyone. Like
yes. I mean, the big thing with illustrations and the stories that we tell, even we do this in our curriculum, we try to go wide. The wider you can go. And one of our staff people said, it's the difference between Starbucks and McDonald's, right? So the idea there would be your examples should be more like a McDonald's example than a Starbucks example. There's only so many people that are going to spend $5 for a pumpkin spice latte. There are a ton of people who are getting a 99-cent sweet tea, at McDonald's.
Yeah.
And that is the approach that we should take when we're looking at how to apply the story of God to the story of us. The wider we go, the more people that we get.
That's good to find the common ground, because somewhere there is a common denominator probably. What about this? Obviously, I don't believe this at all, but you hear it from time to time, probably more with adults than with kids and students. But this idea of we should just teach the Bible. It's the Word of God. It doesn't need contextualization or whatever. Yeah. It's powerful. It's double-edged sword. And I know what they're. I mean, I can't even say it straight face, but yeah,
all of those things are so true. But I, when I look at the New Testament writers, even if I look at the Gospels contextualize the story of Jesus to their audience. The details that they chose to include, the way that they chose to build those stories really had a lot to do with their audience. If you have, Luke, who's talking to, a more Greek audience, he's going to include details about how Jesus was talking about the inclusion of all people into the kingdom of God. Where Matthew, talking to a primarily Jewish audience, he's going to highlight the fact that, Jesus is the answer to all of the prophecies and all of the different things. Like, he's going to hit that, differently. And, I think that was the ultimate struggle that, even Peter and Paul had, in the early church, as people outside of the Jewish tradition, people who did not know the stories, the ancient stories of the Jewish faith. Paul was just trying to make it easy for people to enter the kingdom of God. And he was like, let's not make them jump through hoops. Let's just realize that the story of Jesus is for everyone. And I'm going to contextualize it in Athens. I'm going to contextualize it in Philippi. I'm going to contextualize it, to my Roman audience. And I'm going to pull out what needs to be pulled out so people can believe and people can be transformed. And we're not so unlike that. We live in a world that is a competing narrative against the biblical narrative. And we need to help kids, we need to help students contextualize these ancient stories to a modern world. I mean, that's what relevance means. Relevance is not bells and whistles. It's just making ancient truth apply to modern life. And we, when we just teach the Bible and we just say, hey, I'm just going to teach this. I'm going to, however it falls. Well, it's not that God can't do something with that, but God also gave us, minds that have done research. When you did a podcast, with Kristen Ivy about her, her phase project, and the research that we have learned from that with how kids learn, that is super important, because if I don't want to teach above them. I don't want to give them a story that they can't handle, or I don't want to, include a detail that could scare them. We gave my daughter her first Bible when she was 9 years old, but we didn't give her a reading plan. So she just started reading the Bible, and all of a sudden she comes down and she's crying and she's like, it was so great. And then all of a sudden someone died, and there was rock and there was blood spilling on the ground. And all of a sudden I realized, she's reading, the murder of Abel, at the beginning of Genesis, which is just this horrible brotherly feud, that ends in death. And, she's sobbing, and I'm like, wow, I missed the boat on this. Like, I just figured, oh, she can read and it's great. And she can't, she just wasn't ready for that story. And so when we're looking at our audience and we're looking at their personal narratives, we're also looking at a scientific narrative. We're looking at a research narrative that allows us to contextualize scripture in not only a way that's relevant to the culture and their personal narrative, but that's relevant to how they think and how they process information at their age. So I can, even talking to high school students, I can engage them and ask them questions about scripture. And it's not going to scare them. And it's not going to scare me to say, hey, I'm asking this philosophical question. They need to wrestle with truth on their level if we want them to own it. And so knowing all of that really helps us connect the story of God to the story of their life.
We'll link to, because you have a resource too to help people think through some questions to ask about their audience before they teach. And again, that's helpful even if you didn't write the teaching. I mean, even if you're taking something that was written and you kind of tweaked it for yourself. Yes. So we'll link to that, right? And it's basically questions you can think through.
And Nick, that's a great point actually about if you have a script, because a lot of us in children's ministry, we're just handed a script. Yeah. But that script was written by, even the scripts we write, they're written for 6,000 churches that are all over the map. And your audience better than I know your audience as the lead editor for this curriculum. Yes. So these questions that I've put together, there's 5 of them. They just get you to think about your audience and how you could, just make a tweak here and there to make it connect even better.
That's good. And now, practically speaking, that's one thing that helps a lot is training ourselves and our leaders to know our audience and apply it that way. But what are some other tips that leaders can take and they can use, or they can pass them on to their volunteer teams to make sure we're communicating, better up front as we teach the Bible?
Absolutely. I think for student pastors, even for children's pastors, one of the things to remember is that you might not be the best communicator in the room. You just get paid to be on staff. And, which that, when that reality hits, that can be hard because you're like, well, I'm the pastor. I should be the one that's communicating. And yes, maybe you should be communicating, but maybe you're a better host. Maybe you're not the best Bible communicator. You're not the best storyteller. It doesn't mean that you don't play a role, but it means that your role shifts and that you bring people around you that are excellent communicators. Maybe they've been communicating for their entire life. If I look at my journey and why this has become something that's huge for me, I've been communicating on some level since I've been in elementary school. I've been doing theater for the last, 35 years of my life. It is just something that's just a part of me. And I wanted people to be able to have those sorts of skills, and so I think looking at your storyteller's strengths, your communicator's strengths, and scheduling them accordingly, if I'm going to tell the story of, Hannah and how, she prayed to God for her baby Samuel, it'd be much better if I had a woman deliver that story. It's going to connect better. At the same time, there are going to be certain people in student ministry that can talk about sex better than others. And so when you need to do your purity talk, or when you're telling the story of David and Bathsheba, to high schoolers, you're going to get the right person to do that. So definitely having the right people on board and knowing who's the best communicator for the story that, you want to deliver is definitely probably a great place to start. But then you need to know how other people are communicating to these kids. I would always tell my family experience actors, hey, you need to be watching Disney television. You need to know, how are people that make billions of dollars every year in media, how are they communicating to this age group, and what can we learn from that? And it doesn't mean that we, copy everything they do and just become this, we just mimic Disney, or we mimic, what's on YouTube, all the YouTube stars that are out there. But what can we use? What can we leverage from what they do well to communicate? And so it's that to me is just knowing, oh, wow, like humor really works for middle schoolers, like really silly, goofy humor works for middle schoolers. So I am going to heighten those moments, in the narrative that I'm going to present to them, or in the personal anecdotes, those stories that I tell. Those are huge. The other thing is being prepared. I think, we're like, we get these great communicators, we give them a slap on the back and we say, you're good to go. You're great. And at the same time, it's like, wait a second, we can give them, before they even step on stage, we can just give them a little, hey, it'd be great if you're not looking at your script the whole time. Well, what does that mean? What does memorizing a script look like? Well, I would say some tips and tricks for that one, because that one's a great one. The more you can make eye contact with your audience, the more you're going to connect with them. You don't need to like memorize everything word for word, because honestly, you're in the moment not going to remember the word for word. And if you're going to try to do that, it's going to trip you up. And so knowing the gist of where you're going, especially in elementary school, if you know that like you're telling, like say the story of David and Goliath or the story of Joseph, that story. So just get that story in you, read it in the Bible, read over your script, and just tell that story. Don't get so caught up on the words, but look at the arc of where the story's headed and learn that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Like you got to find a way to own it, but not memorize. Because I can't memorize. Because if I ever memorized, I would, like you said, I would get lost. Because if I messed up one time, it's like, I don't know, it's like, House of Cards. The whole thing falls down because I don't know where absolutely. I was. Where do I go back to? What did I leave out? Versus if it's kind of like sections. I don't do this as well as I'd like, but I try to think of it like steps in a journey, like a map.
Yes.
So, okay, now I'm kind of done in this area. Yep. Where's the next area I need to walk to? That way, if I do forget something in the moment, it's like, oh, well, I got to go. I know where I'm going next. Maybe if I can come back to it, great. If not,
and actually, that's
sense.
Great. Like those transitions between the sections are super important for your kids. Like I always tell communicators, know how you're getting to where you're going. And help kids know that too. So like when you're transitioning from one part of the story to the next part of the story, or from point 1 to point 2, you may need to say, you need to lead them. You need to say something like, hey, that was great. We're moving on to this next section. So like you're basically prepping their brain, and you're probably prepping your own brain. Hey, we're talking about something new now. So get ready to pay attention again, because you've probably stopped paying attention at some point in the last 2 minutes here. So it's like, hey, we're getting to the next thing. And it's just this trigger. Transitions are so great, and they're so vital in large group environments, because it's triggering the brain that something new is about to happen, and we need to pay attention in a different way. We tend to forget transitions in large group environments, and we just kind of just talk aimlessly. But we need to help walk the kids through the outline as much as we need to walk ourselves through the outline as we try to remember it.
Yeah, and I think that probably stood out to me when I read, which I'm sure you read too, Andy Stanley's book, Communicating for a Change, years ago. Because he talks about in there how he pretty much has most of it. Anybody's seen him, he doesn't use notes. But the transitions are where he leans in. One of the places he leans in a lot, like he'll even write them out, he says, because it's just like you said, it's a place where it's important. You can get people to re-engage if they've kind of fallen off. They can come back. And if we don't emphasize them, you're right. They're just messy and, I don't know, not even existent. And it doesn't help people. They're still lost. We didn't have them, and now we still don't have them, which is tough. One thing that I bet a lot of leaders don't do is have some way to evaluate their communicators regularly. And you think that's important. Obviously, you did create, just like the resource for kind of some questions to help you know your audience. You created a resource to help staff or whoever evaluate their communicators. So we'll link to that. But why do you think that's important? And practically, is it something you think should be done every time somebody teaches, every few times? How do you think that should look, and how do you do it in a way that's like, because volunteers are going to feel pressure already, right?
Yeah.
So how do we help them grow using evaluation without making them feel like, oh, you stink. So you need evaluation.
And hopefully that they're not going to like completely be the worst person, ever before they get on stage. But, okay, so like, I think that there's three areas where we need to do ongoing training when it comes to our communicators. There's before they even get on stage, and you're going to say, hey, you're engaging kids with the story of the Bible. This is the most important story ever. And you kind of vision cast, we are a competing narrative against everything else that they listen to, they watch. I mean, my kids are in middle school. 2 of them have smartphones. They're watching YouTube videos right in the palm of their hands. Like they know a good story when they see it, right? And so the more we can set our storytellers up on the front end and say, hey, you need to command the stage. You can't just, tennis match back and forth, walking across the stage. Like that's not going to work. It's not going to fly. You can use your voice. These are different ways you can use your voice. You can lend characterization. These are actual people who actually lived, help kids understand that by like, having Goliath talk like this, or, David's strength and trusting God, like he's confident. And so he needs to, when you're talking about him, like you need to stand confidently. And that plays along in just even how you tell your own story when you're telling, anecdotes or illustrations. How you stand and how you move on stage communicates a lot about whether kids are going to pay attention to you or not. And so those are things that you need to kind of, before they even get on stage, just kind of train them and say, hey, here are 3 things that you can go over. Like, know your script, know where you're headed, know where you're standing. Don't just walk around aimlessly, and use your voice to its best advantage. Don't be monotone. Don't yell the whole time. Soft and silent is actually sometimes more effective than anything else that you can do. But then as they get on stage, you can't just let them go. I mean, you could, but it's kind of that idea where you need to have a pulse of how your storytellers are doing or whether they're connecting with kids. I mean, ultimately, you want kids to engage in this relationship between a storyteller and their audience. Storytelling, even by definition, it's a two-way dynamic communication that the audience does play a role in how they're listening to the story. And so there needs to be some sort of rapport between the storyteller and the audience, or the communicator in student ministries and the audience. And this doesn't mean that as the pastor or as their coach or leader, however you set up that structure, that you're like in there every single week evaluating them. But you need to periodically go in and say, how does this room feel? Is there a good rapport happening? Do the kids feel comfortable? Is the storyteller, is the communicator speaking in such a way that respects the audience, that doesn't talk down to them? Are they, engaging them? That all of those things, you can't feel unless you're in the room actually evaluating them. Now, on the other side of it, you need your storytellers to self-evaluate, that you should be videotaping them every so often. Again, not every week, but if they're a good storyteller, they're going to want to get better at their craft as much as you want them to get better at their craft, and their skill of storytelling. So I would do this, like I would videotape, and you can do this just with your phone. Like I'm using this antiquated videotape term, but you can just record it on your phone and you can have them, you can post it to, a private YouTube page or a private Vimeo, password protected, and let them watch it and self-evaluate. Because, when I look at myself communicate, because I want to be better at this, it's sometimes really awkward. You're like, oh man, why did I say that? I shouldn't have said that, or I shouldn't have said it like this. But when you're communicating, you're not evaluating. You're just thinking about the message that you're trying to tell. And that's what you're focused on. So to look outside of it as like a third party, that really helps you because you're like, oh, my voice is, it's like, even like the pitch of your voice. I don't know if you do this, but like you get really excited and all of a sudden you're talking up here, but you don't know, but everyone else knows you're talking up here, but no one else knows you're talking way up here because you're just so excited. And then, you watch that back and you're like, oh, wow, that was an awful 5 minutes right there.
5 minutes is a long time to talk at that high level.
Yeah, I know.
People like, I need a break.
It's like, oh my word, like what was I thinking? Because I think like if you watch yourself, that like takes the pressure off of whoever the staff person is that's evaluating, because a person knows whether they connected or not. If they're really honest and they're, self-aware, and hopefully most people are. I mean, not everyone's self-aware, and that's a whole different, conversation for another day about how to handle with that. But the self-evaluation is huge, that you could say what connected, what didn't, what story worked, what story didn't. Am I talking at their level? All of those things, can come out. Did I use the stage effectively? Did I make sure I made eye contact with kids, or was I looking at my script the whole time? And that's kind of the downloadable that I made, that we can link to. It has those sorts of questions. So it really gets them thinking holistically about the talk, not just about the words they're saying, but how they're saying them and how the audience may or may not be reacting to them.
And that's good that you're talking about being self-evaluation, because, again, that's where it can make it less, I don't know, kind of like we're holding them accountable and now they're all nervous about it versus more, you want to get better and we want to help. So here, you answer these questions for yourself. How do you think we did? And then we talk about it.
Yeah.
And you're right. Most of the time, you're probably just going to affirm what they're saying, even if it's a critique of themselves. Like, yeah, that probably could have been. But I think a lot of times most people aren't super confident. And so it's also a time to encourage them, too. You can use that that part could have been better, but you really did well here. I thought they connected, like that kind of thing. And we probably don't do that either, actually. So
no, we don't.
It's probably nothing. We probably don't do much of anything other than see you next time.
We are so focused on just, making Sunday happen that we forget that these are people with a skill, and, we can have a training ground right in our ministry environments to help promote better communicators. Absolutely. The other thing that, part of the evaluation, it could be a 360 evaluation, because you could put some of it on them to, like, did you have your script on time? Did you have what you need when you walked into the room? Were all of your props there? Did you have to, hunt someone down in order to know whether your slides were loaded into ProPresenter? Like, we want to serve our communicators as much as we want our communicators to serve kids. And so we need to make sure we're doing that well too.
That's good. This probably is just a simple way to say it, but something else that we probably don't do enough, and I feel like we haven't done enough and we're doing more, is just trainings with all of our communicators. And we've even just lumped them in. Like, if you host, bring the hosts and the storytellers in. Even though that's different, there's still just an on-stage part of it that we could do together and, stuff like that. Have you seen churches do that? Do you recommend that? Is that something people should do, annually or something? Yeah,
people, absolutely. I would do them when I was a children's pastor. I would bring my storytellers. I'd have a monthly meeting with all my storytellers and hosts, just to kind of talk about how we're doing. I would do one small tip or trick that they could, put into practice. But then I would do a big one at the beginning of the year where we would do improv games. We would do sort of like workshops, and take a look at acting skills. How can you voice these characters? How can you plan out your movement on the stage? Reading your script for the first time. What are the notes that you should take? All of those sort of things. Like giving them the tools so that regardless of the script, they can read it through and they can make a plan for themselves for how they're going to communicate. I think that that's a huge thing, because you don't want your storytellers to feel unprepared. You don't want your communicators to feel unprepared. And to bring them together, then you can you can workshop things and you can talk about them as they're happening. Like grab a couple people, have them do a script on stage. And as they're doing it, say, hey, what if you made this choice about what you just said? So instead of being angry, you're more frustrated because yes, they're on the same spectrum, but they're different. And maybe the character is more frustrated than angry. And what would that do, to that story? Or that, that sort of thing. Or like have them give their own testimony, have them tell their own story, because that's a huge part of being a communicator, being able to share your personal stories about how the Bible has impacted your life. That's a skill that you can develop. What details do I include? What details do I leave out? That may be not appropriate for this audience. I don't need to tell everyone about, all the things that I did in high school that I regret. Maybe I allude to them, but people in the moment, they don't have those imaginary conversations with themselves in the moment. They need to prepare ahead of time, and we need to give them a chance to do that in a good way.
Yeah, it probably would help too. I mean, a simple way I'm thinking about, like if somebody's new, it would be great probably to give them face-to-face time with multiple other communicators just to see, what do you do to prepare? Like, what does your week look like when you teach? Because as we're talking about it, I'm thinking, I don't know that we do that enough. We teach that, but like it almost be, and there is like an apprenticing type of thing going on.
Yeah.
But it's usually from our coaches or our staff to them, almost pushing that down, so to speak, as opposed to another storyteller, another host who's been doing this for a while. What do you do? That probably would be really helpful.
Yes, the best practices idea. Absolutely. Yeah, because we, as church staff, we live it. It's our job, so we have the luxury of being able to think about it more, where, these kids, students, these communicators, storytellers, adults, they either are in school, for 40 hours a week, they are working 60 hours a week. How do they prepare in the midst of their real life for Sunday? And a great way to do that. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Is almost creating these mentors, of storytellers and hosts and communicators that have been doing it a while. That's huge.
Yeah, that'll probably help them. We could definitely do that better, I think. I hope we help them already, but I just think hearing from multiple other people makes it like more realistic, or something they can apply more. Oh, that's how you do that. It takes you this long to read that, or you write notes here. You rehearse this part. Like that all would help them think, okay, here's what I could do. So obviously this has been awesome and really helpful, and I hope people will take it, download those resources from you and apply it and help their communicators get better. But if they have any questions, if they just want to connect with you, because you're continuing to do research about story too, how can they connect with you?
Yes. I am on Twitter at DanScott77. I also have a blog, danscottblog.com. And really, I've been focusing on this whole idea of storytelling and telling better Bible stories. And I love the research that I'm doing, and I love being able to share it with leaders and communicators, whether they're volunteers or their staff. I just feel this passion to help kids hear a better Bible story, because, too much hangs in the balance of a kid hearing a bad Bible story. We want them to engage with the Word of God. And so, I talk a lot about that on my blog. I'm also on Instagram. Everything's DanScott77. So if they want to connect with me, that is the best way.
Awesome. Well, thank you for taking time coming on the podcast. Thanks for what you do, writing for Orange, and for the whole team there, putting out the 600,000 words a month. It's really helpful. It's helping a lot of churches, so we appreciate it. Thanks,
absolutely, man. Nick. This was great. Thanks.
I don't know about you, but in that conversation and with a conversation I had with a future podcast guest that will hit soon, I'm reminded of how we could probably do a better job training up our leaders, our storytellers, our communicators specifically. We do some things to help them a lot, but are we doing enough? I'm not sure, and I want them to be well equipped. And so I think one thing you could do coming out of this podcast is go to the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 31. And from there, You can get some of those free resources that Dan created that we talked about, and then you can take this and apply it in your ministry and help your teachers and your communicators get better as we all harness the power of story to teach kids and teach students. Don't forget to take that survey, nickblevins.com/ratio survey. Make sure your church's input is in there. You'll also be entered to win one of those 26 prizes that we're giving away, so you don't want to miss that. Just a few days left there. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast, and always love when you can go on iTunes and give a rating and a review. That really helps get it in front of other leaders. In the next episode, I talk with Jeff Cochran of YM Lead, and we talk about leadership development. We really break down their system to develop leaders in student ministry, which you can apply it to children's ministry or any ministry for that matter. And we really break it down. What does it look like? What are the components? How do they train and develop people from, one level to the next? It's really, really practical, really helpful, and you don't want to miss it. So be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.